Hi, this is Stephen DeVincenzi. Today we have a very special bonus episode. I'm talking to Andrew Ryvkin. Andrew is a Russian American who, in his own words, used to work as a Russian propagandist. This episode was quite long, so I've cut it into two. In this first part, we talk about Andrew's time working at a Russian magazine for the ultra-rich, his time working on a political TV show in which he was directly given orders from the Russian government, and when he left that show and was beaten up in the street by other propagandists for President Putin. In the second part, we focus more on how Russian propaganda works, why it is different to media in other countries, how Andrew sees Russian propaganda adapting and being effective, the war in Ukraine, and why Andrew thinks that Russia will lose the war. I am really excited to bring you this interview because Andrew is in such a unique position. It is very rare for people to have worked in Russian propaganda to be able to talk about it afterwards, and even more rare for them to have English as a native language. And something else excellent about this interview is that Andrew has been kind enough to say that he is happy to answer your questions in another episode later on. So, while you are listening, if a question comes to you that you would like to ask Andrew, send it to me in an email to podcast@send7.org. Or if you are listening on an app that supports comments, like Spotify or Castbox, then you can write your question for Andrew there. Send7 is completely free, but is supported by our wonderful Send7 supporters, who have access to all of our transcripts, including this one, and also vocabulary lists, weekly worksheets, and a weekly world news quiz. You can become a supporter at send7.org. Part 2 of this episode will be released next Saturday. Now, here is Andrew Ryvkin. I'm joined by Andrew Ryvkin. Andrew, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start talking about your time in the Russian media world, maybe you can give a little bit of background about your life, including about how you are both American and Russian.
Of course. I was born in the 80s, and I witnessed the fall of the Soviet Union, but before I went to school, so just as a very little kid, but I got to see all the quote unquote wonderful stuff that was happening. So empty shelves in stores, supermarkets, etc. And like many, right after the Iron Curtain crumbled, the Soviet Union fell, like many Soviet Jewish families. We lived in Leningrad, later St. Petersburg. We decided to, seek a better life overseas, many people did. So we moved to the United States, to Boston. I was 10. And I went to school there. So grade school, everything, high school, lived there I want to say 10, 12 years, something like that. And then I made the very interesting choice to actually go back to Russia, which was a brand new country. It was a different country. Um,
What year was
when
this?
I came to Russia in 2002,
So you were
or
maybe
2003, something like that. I was 20.
20. Okay, right.
Yeah. I was 20. So, no, 19 even, 19 or 20, something like that. I would have to look closer. That was a while ago. So I came back and I came back to St. Petersburg. It was a, capitalist, wild west, wild east heaven. Very dangerous place, very fascinating place. Lots of like new bars and social norms and parties. And it was generally so much more exciting than the Boston suburb in Massachusetts where I lived, because that place, we used to hang out on parking lots. I
Yeah.
mean, it was the American Northeast, so very civilized. Harvard was nearby, everything. But as an immigrant, Boston is not the most welcoming city, although I love it with all my heart. And I kind of felt like, the pull of the empire, so to speak. I enrolled in St. Petersburg State University, which is Putin's alma mater. It's known for producing such greats as Vladimir Lenin, Ayn Rand, and Vladimir Putin, with a bunch of physicists and like Nobel laureates and stuff. But it does produce a lot of political extremists on all specters, left, right, modern Russian ultra right. Um, and I studied there. I studied history for bachelor's, international relations for master's degree. Um, and that's afterwards. So I started working for Kremlin Media already in university, but afterwards I did spend some time in Russia, and then I kind of lived between Russia and America. I still consider myself to be a product of both. Um, you know, I would have to, when I lived in Russia, I had American cereal, which is breakfast cereal, delivered to me via eBay, where I bought it for like $50 a box, but like I just had to have it. And I would try to download American, let's say not illegally, I would try to download American TV shows and like watch Seinfeld and stuff like that because we didn't have it in Russia back then. So I consider myself a child of like very much two of these cultures, but my formative years were spent in the US, and that kind of did shape me. But 20s and later on, of course, Russia, this new Russia, and I got to witness the oil boom and this period that is considered the most stable and free period in Russia, early Putin, money, oil, restaurants, and this opening to the world, how Russia opened to the world, not with the face of poverty, but with the face of, we're rich now. We want to be civilized. We want contemporary art. We want, to have this interaction with the West. And then, of course, I witnessed the descent, Russia's descent into I would say fascism. Probably you could classify it as that, into this neo-imperialist mindset.
Okay, well, before we get
Yes.
there, you mentioned there like after you finished university, or maybe while you were still at university, that was when you started to work for, in your words, the Kremlin's propaganda machine.
In my funny thing about Russian propaganda, first and foremost, I came into that world, into the world of Russian propaganda, not because I was into politics. I was, but still, I came into that world from the world of marketing. I was a brand manager for a brand of wine and some champagne in St. Petersburg. And I used to go around nightclubs. I would create parties. I would, promote that wine, everything. I would like, sponsor raves, things like that. I was good at that. And I created advertising campaigns for that. Like my sales were through the roof. And a friend who was head of the company where I worked, he recommended me to this man. His name is Konstantin Rykov. And that man is considered the godfather of modern Russian digital propaganda, of internet propaganda. I would say godfather of not just Russian, pretty much everywhere. He truly had very evil, but a visionary nonetheless, very keen understanding of how the media works. And when I was in my junior year, so for those of us not from the United States, third year of college, um, in my junior year, he did invite me to Moscow. We had a breakfast. It was sushi and vodka,
Wow.
which is very traumatizing but interesting. And he said, I'm launching a magazine, a glossy lifestyle magazine like GQ, like Vogue. And it's going to be aimed at the richest of the rich Russians. And I want you to head its St. Petersburg bureau. You're going to produce it. You're going to be chief of the editorial in St. Petersburg, co-publisher. So you're going to handle that magazine there. Would you like that? And I said yes, of course, because I was always drawn to that, world of glamour. Not anymore, but back then definitely. So it's my junior year in college, third year, and what my job, I described my job. The magazine was very interesting in the sense that it mixed a classic lifestyle magazine for the ultra rich, and I'm talking like buy this Mercedes for only $500,000. This new jewelry came out, very exclusive, only two pieces in Moscow. You would have this like really like targeting the multimillionaires because Russia was getting all that oil money because America invaded Iraq. So it was this very, you invade Iraq, Russia gets money, I get a job. But in this magazine, you would have interviews with the with the top minds of Russian ideology, of Russia's imperialist ideology. It would have articles on Putin. It would have think pieces that would say the West doesn't want a strong Russia. It would have interviews with, I don't know, people like Alexander Dugin, who's considered the father of modern Russian fascism, one of the people whose teachings have very much influenced Vladimir Putin. And all of it would be neatly packaged into this lifestyle magazine. And the interesting thing about it was if you were not rich, you wouldn't even know that this magazine existed. You couldn't buy it anywhere. It would only be distributed in the most exclusive restaurants, in the most exclusive hotels, private jet terminals, et cetera, et cetera. And it was one of these very interesting concepts that Rykov, my boss, had, where the Kremlin messaging towards the rich was going to reach them specifically through this medium because they all read glossy magazines about, it would have interviews with Western pop stars and movie stars. It would have reviews of hotels like, oh, this boutique hotel in Switzerland, you have to visit it. It would have all of that plus ideology. So that's essentially what I was doing at the age of 23 or something like that.
Was the Kremlin ideology in there because your boss wanted it to be alone, or was it because the Kremlin wanted it to be there? How did that message get pushed along like that?
Um, my boss was open to having this Kremlin ideology there because at the time he was already working with the Kremlin. So, Russian propaganda is unique in the sense that it most of it you see Russian propaganda and you think it's TV hosts saying let's drown America, let's bomb this, and yes, it's that. But so much of it is a public-private enterprise. And Rykov, he had a for-profit magazine. He made money off of that magazine, and he wanted to do a lifestyle magazine. It's just that he integrated Kremlin's messaging into it, and I don't know, but I'm very much sure that he got paid in through some various channels by the Kremlin for that. Not, of course, not officially. Nothing was ever official. You would get a contract of a subcontract of a subcontract, something like that, but you would in the end have the money. So the Kremlin was interested in it as an outlet, and he was interested in the Kremlin as a client. But also, of course, he was very much a pro-Putin guy, still is. So it was a mix of both. He would make the money, the Kremlin would reach the target audience that it was looking for.
So maybe if he wanted to make this magazine without the Kremlin messaging, it would have been possible, but it just wouldn't have made that much money, or it wouldn't have had the funding from the Kremlin in that way. Is that right?
I'm yes, plus also I think it would not have had the guests and the people who would give their interviews because it was a lot of very serious people, people in power, people who would otherwise probably not talk to just a random magazine.
Right.
It was like chief correspondents for newspapers, for Russia's key newspapers that would travel with Putin, who were in the presidential press pool, and they would talk about their jobs. These people, they wouldn't really go to any magazine. So you would need some reputation and some credentials as that you are part of the system. So they would talk to you. But definitely he could do it on his own. It wouldn't be as well funded. It wouldn't have these people
Yeah.
talking to it.
Yeah. And then you moved to a TV show, right?
Yes. So little later, a little later, another friend of mine was actually in Spain. I was in Spain, not far from where you are. I was in Spain, and I met an official from the Kremlin there, as at like a friendly dinner on some villa, uh, and that official was launching. That was, I think, 2008. That official was launching a TV show, and he was very much interested in a talk show, a national talk show on a federal channel that would go all across Russia, obviously. So not local, big budget, everything. And his concept was we need the kind of TV show that would a TV show for the people who don't really watch TV because TV is boring and TV is for old people and TV is outdated. So even back then, they kind of felt this, and this was the 2000s. This was before YouTube. Well, YouTube appeared, but it wasn't massive back then. And they kind of felt that, to get a younger audience, to get a more well-off audience, middle class, smart, educated people, it's very hard to deal with television. Mostly in Russia at that time, you would have fun TV shows, serials, whatever on television and movies, but when it came to politics, only old people would watch that and just watch it and get angry. You wouldn't have younger people. And the idea was we'll create a show that has opposing points of view. It was based in part on like French TV shows where very big studio, you would have different people, a left person of left-leaning views, right-leaning center. But the idea was this is financed by the Kremlin. This is made according to the Kremlin's agenda. Every week, the Kremlin would set its agenda and it would say, okay, this week we're covering pensions or we're covering relations with Moldova, say, for instance. And every TV channel, every show, newspaper that was loyal to the Kremlin, in part funded by it, it would cover it in a certain way, in their own style. And the TV show style was you would have people very much opposing the Kremlin's point of view. But my my task was to co-produce the show, to alter its format to make it better through, you shoot one TV show pilot, something's not working, something you fix it, like you modify it to better fit TV. And it was, of course, to write every episode. And what we did was you would get this Kremlin idea, pensions. We want to raise the pensions or we want to lower them. And I would get this Kremlin brief and I would rate three points of view: a left-leaning point of view, centrist, right-leaning. Of course, based on Russian policy, so it's not like European left or American left. It's based on the Russian political spectrum. And then we would look for people with the experts. They could be members of parliament, they could be media persons, even actors if needed, with these points of view who adhere to these points of view. And then we would find an ordinary Russian citizen, say a factory worker, who's about to retire, and the question of pensions matters to him very much. So what does he do? So essentially, it was these experts, a lot of them working for the government, would try to defend their position to this ordinary Russian citizen. At some point, we got rid of the idea of an ordinary Russian citizen. By that time, I left the show because it was proving to be a little opposition minded. A lot of Russian citizens, they weren't exactly in line with the Kremlin. But that was the general idea. And of course, no matter the debates, it was still the Kremlin always won. Its position was always that of the house always won, like in a casino. In a casino, you can play, you can win, but the casino wins, really, always. And that was the same thing there.
So you had somebody from the left, somebody from the right, somebody from the center, but you had somebody else giving the Kremlin's view, or was it one of those three would be shown to be the correct one? but it is the same as the Kremlin thought, or somebody else.
One of those three would more often than not be the correct one, and the host would sort of massage this position into sort of persuading that this was the more correct version. And it would often be positioned as the left say and the right would they would say some reasonable things, but more often than not, they would be not fringes, but almost fringes. They would be saying things that most people in Russia wouldn't agree with, probably. And the centrist, the idea was to make the Kremlin sound rational, to make it wasn't specifically said that, oh, well, and this is the Kremlin's point of view. No, it wasn't said like that, even if we had Kremlin officials. Nothing was direct. But it was still the idea, well, this person is just more rational. This person is just like, and the host would sort of agree with that person more. Now, that again was when I was working. At some point, this, of course, this was proven to be the Kremlin got a little paranoid. And towards the end of the 2000s, early 2010s, and they said, you know what, we need to push our agenda without these like opposing views. And the show lost its ratings and it went off air. I exited the show before that. But the reason why it stayed on air was this image of a debate. And that was a very hard thing to do. You have to create an image of a debate. And that was like the entire policy, the entire domestic policy, because it was all handled by the presidential
It's
administration.
kind of
And
like professional wrestling, where they have
exactly.
everything scripted and everybody knows who's going to win in the end, but it looks like a dramatic
Yes.
fight.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the hits looked real and it was theater. It was political theater, but very carefully staged. The amount of effort and money that went into it was rather staggering at times. Nothing like what it is now. And I would say nothing like what it is now, even in America, where also, the state acts very strongly. In Russia, back then, it was the state tried to act in a very sophisticated and cunning ways to reach its goals through a program like this, through a magazine that would affect the rich people that would reach them. So you would have this very insidious kind of way to influence people, as they wouldn't even know that something's influencing them.
Um, did you did you know at the time when you were working in the magazine and in the TV show, did you already feel like you were working for propaganda, or was there a specific moment where it clicked for you that you were working in this propaganda machine?
So when I worked at the magazine, I did not really feel that I was working for the propaganda. This is not to say that oh, I'm innocent, but it just did not really feel like it because I would say 85% of the stuff I did was restaurants, parties, the new Mercedes Benz, things like that. And what these interviews that came with Kremlin people or like Kremlin linked people, they came in from Moscow. I didn't really handle that. They just were there, sort of. And to me, I was much more focused on the glamorous side of things, and not on the Kremlin side of things. But then with the TV show, I completely understood what was going on because it literally started with a Kremlin official, with a meeting with a Kremlin official. He was, well, in Russia, we measure everything. Power is measured in handshakes. How many handshakes are you away from Putin? It's not people, it's how many handshakes. So you shook the hand of someone who knows someone who worked for Putin, which was my situation. My boss worked for a man who worked directly for Putin, his chief ideologue. So
So,
it was two handshakes.
oh, so you're just two handshakes away from Putin. So
Yes, yes.
that's
Even though obviously it's not as if I did not hold any high position or anything like that. Obviously, these people were, they were state officials and they were very powerful in the world of propaganda. But it was a very direct. not a direct line to Putin, but it was in proximity. So not with the magazine, but with the TV show, it was very much in proximity. It was an important show for the Kremlin.
Yeah. And you said that towards the end of the time that you were on that show, they started to give you even more specific and direct instructions to target the opposition or to follow the Kremlin's line even more specifically. And you say that that's when you left. Was that part of the decision as to why you left?
Uh, definitely, because prior to that, I could explain to myself, I could rationalize, well, there's still a debate. I agreed with some talking points because, again, this was before Crimea. This was before, this was during and after the war in Georgia, which I then disregarded. Sadly, I view it differently now. But I could justify some viewpoints. They were not extreme, really. Even now, I don't consider them extreme as someone who's studied politics. You can't say they were like fringe, but they were part of an agenda. But then the Kremlin did start, it became more paranoid, like I said. It said, you know what, we don't want like the debate style. We want a more direct style. We want three people who more or less agree on one thing. We don't want this ordinary citizen to be there. We don't want to take these risks, and we have this opposition. Navalny wasn't big back then, but still there was Gary Kasparov, who's now, an intellectual here in the United States, obviously a symbol of freedom fighter from Russia, exiled,
He's
sadly.
also a colleague of yours at the Atlantic.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And you would start you, and it was very sudden. So television goes by seasons, as we all know. You start in September, roughly. You end in May. Nothing comes out in the summer. TV shows are like that. Most news talk shows are like that. Comedy shows, and one season ended, and they kind of saw the ratings weren't amazing, but the Kremlin mostly got paranoid. We hired a new director, and that director was like, it needs to be. That director was very much a propagandist in the sense that it was. Can I swear on this podcast? Can I say the word shit or not?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Okay. So I just to clarify. So that the Kremlin hired a new director for us, suggested, and we hired him. And that director's concept was the first thing the audience has to do when they turn on the television is they have to shit themselves. They have to be bombarded with so much emotional overload, like this is happening and this is happening and everything is going to hell, and what are we going to do about this? As opposed to the more moderate messaging we had before. And that, so you could see that emotionally it became much more charged, the tone of the program itself, not the arguments. And then you could see that we would get directions, oh, bash this guy and bash that guy. And very soon afterwards, just very early in the start of the season, I exited. I threw a public spat, very I said, well, you guys are very much Kremlin shills. Like, I can't do this. Even though I understood it was propaganda, but just not this level of propaganda. And yes, and I exited the show. I quit. So that was the breaking point, you could say.
Yeah. And I read in your Atlantic article that a couple of years after you left that show, you were attacked by a couple of men who worked on that show, I think, or were related to that show in some way. Is that right? Can you tell us about that?
Yes, that's right. A couple of years later, I was working as a GQ Russia chief political correspondent. I transitioned to journalism, and I tried to sort of explain this system to the Russian people, the system where I worked at. It's still what I do, is I try to explain, because I was inside the system, I try to explain how it thinks and what it does. Um, and it was on the day right after the 2012 presidential election when Putin won his third unconstitutional term as president. And on the day after, I was invited to an interview at the Russia's biggest press agency, Interfax Russia. They invited me to like GQ got a call, and it was like we're inviting Andrew to speak. Well, Andrei, my Russian name is Andrei. And I went, and near that, it's about half a mile from the Kremlin, something like that. And when I came to the agency just at its doors, I was met by two men. One of them worked at the show, and the other one was trustee of Vladimir Putin. And what this means is for his election, Putin picked 500 people very loyal to him from each industry. So they were factory workers, actors, directors, people in the media, people, doctors, everything, to sort of create this illusion of popular support, even though he was popularly supported. It wasn't like he was an entirely unpopular president in 2012. He created this, and this was one of those, also one of those people. He passed away recently. And they assaulted me and they started beating me right on the street for well, for saying bad things about them, for, and for my political position. And they clearly waited for the election to happen to not do it before. And it was very scandalous because I was still a GQ correspondent, and these people were like really a trustee of Putin. They weren't thugs, which I guess is a mark of honor, of some respect to me that they didn't hire someone to beat me up, but did it them. But still, it was 2-on-1. And when the police came, because police was everywhere in Moscow, obviously elections, they were afraid of protests and riots. And the police came 30 seconds after they started beating me. And they were like, "What the hell are you guys doing?" And they were about to arrest them when the two people who were beating me showed them government documents and government IDs and credentials, which were so powerful that the police looked at them and they said, "Could you at least do it not in the street? Could you go to some yard? Like, we're not going to stop you. It just looks really bad. This is Moscow's. It was on Moscow's basically Fifth Avenue on the main street of Moscow, near the Kremlin. And the police were so afraid of these people. They saw what it says, like the official Vladimir Putin trustee friend, whatever, that they were just, please don't beat him outside on the street. Just do it somewhere else. And
Amazing.
that was very, yeah.
And was the reason that they were beating you up, was it because you left that show, or was it because of things you'd said since you left that show, in the run up to the election or something?
I think it was both. I think it was me having left the show, which was bad. But then that when I transitioned to journalism and to explaining to people how propaganda works, that was I became like a traitor, a rat to them. And that is the worst that you could be in Russia. You can leave the power, you can leave propaganda, you can leave the Kremlin. For the most part, you can do that. But God forbid you cross the line and you start working for other people, which is what I did, for the opposing force, essentially. And any independent media is the opposing force to the Kremlin. Any independent media, any people telling the truth are the enemies of the Kremlin. So when I started doing that, and I didn't have any state secrets, obviously. I was doing like TV shows and magazines. I wasn't working for the KGB, or I wasn't a nuclear physicist or anything like that. But the idea that I was loyal to them and now I wasn't, that was, to them, it was too much. So it was a combination of me being a traitor and me hurting them, because my articles would be popular. The things I wrote, they would get some traction even in the West. And yeah, and they couldn't tolerate that, and that was sort of the message that they wanted to send.